Right. Well, not too easy this. I've over a few days had the problem of reacting to Jay's talk swirling around in my head without knowing what he was going to say, but I had a fair idea, and it's partly a matter of trying to remind myself of what was this thing and what was it all about and why now has it risen from the dead to haunt me. Not quite, but I did write rather sadly obituaries of this approach in the 1980s, and it was one with the benefit of hindsight. I remember an article in the Critical Journal of Mass Communication in 1984, which was a kind of farewell, which regretted some of its weaknesses and failings. But since then, I've become aware that the whole situation has changed anyway. We're in a different media era, and it is not appropriate to simply buttonhole or shelve this approach or whatever with what potential it has, because it is in many ways just indispensable in some form or other. We cannot actually do without it, and it's important to learn a bit from the past, but we can't learn too much because I think the situation is different. And the first point I would like to make, not sort of following some of Jay's remarks, is that it was an approach that was born in a certain time and a certain point in the history of both the mass media and social research, and certainly communication research, pretty much at the beginning, early days, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. These were the early days in the US. Virtually nowhere else in the world, partly because of war, which led to a postponement and then a takeoff in the 1960s in Europe and elsewhere of this and other research applications. But the point I want to make is that one could consider there to have been a completely different paradigm for communication research and the problematizing of its influence, effects, significance, and so on. And the term mass communication covers that pretty well, and it's a pretty familiar idea that we had a pretty large uniform flow of centrally produced content, a bit of an exaggeration, but still the mass media were not highly differentiated in given industrially developed states, or not much internationally either. So we didn't have a great deal of choice as populations, and what we received from cinema, from radio, and gradually later only television, well, and newspapers, was fairly limited in terms of its themes, contents, purpose. Pretty much a mass audience, a new feature, a large population, still relatively unsophisticated, uneducated, enormous appeal of the medium, and this was approached by observers, commentators, busybodies, guardians of public morals, in different ways, and also would-be exploiters of the new medium, or entrepreneurs, or whatever. Anyway, the big concerns of those who sponsored the research and carried it out in those early days were, first, leaving aside the business interest and the management interest, because that was largely behind closed doors, but out in the public we had the moral guardians who were concerned about harmful effects on young people and children and various minority groups and so on. So there were cultural critics concerned about the low quality, so-called, of mass culture, and this was a very judgmental framework that was encouraging certain kinds of research, selective research. There was a perhaps even bigger interest in propaganda and its effects and influence in the form of political propaganda or propaganda on behalf of the state for wartime and other national objectives, or for promote the development of underdeveloped lands, and of course advertising. So the impulses were there in a situation of media availability and a fairly low estimation of the capacity and discernment of the populace. So there was a tendency to regard the people from a high point of more cultural elite and an elite point of view. So a lot of factors then in that mixture, which are just not present now, and that's the first point. And if I think move forward 60 years or more, and consider the new paradigm, which is now the one in which the internet is not knows, I don't know whether the main medium will in some ways become the main medium, if it's a medium in the same sense, which I don't think it is. But it is in its collectivity, essentially, a very large and growing. What are those things that sit in nests, pushed out all the other birds? Cuckoo in the nest, well, whatever. Image one has. Anyway, it is now the centre of much of the flow of communication, and it is a quite different kind of flow because, as we know, it's highly differentiated. It's not a mass offering. It is directed and to many different sources, to many different destinations. It is chosen by many different groups and peoples on different grounds for different reasons in highly diverse ways. It is contributed to by anyone who wants to. It is interactive, not one way, and so on. It is a quite different situation. It is not subject to moral guidelines. That doesn't mean there isn't a framework of norms and values by which it is judged, and there are a number of familiar critiques of the internet range which are not unfamiliar. For instance, various forms of addiction to use, for instance, by young people in either an undesirable types of content or in simply time wasting, as the problem with a scene for television was simply children were wasting time. They weren't out playing in the fields and preparing for the Olympic Games and so on, but they were just sitting on the chairs watching TV, and that was bad. And nowadays, of course, you get a repeat of similar fears and moral panics. Okay, there are a few similarities, but there is no notion of the internet as a propaganda device. The effects of the internet in that sense are not really spoken of because, in theory at least, the internet has no uniform effects. It has any kind of effect that anyone might want. There is no passive audience. The audience is active by definition. It is able to and does actually choose. Okay, so that's my first. I kept coming back to that reflection when I was thinking about this. Why would we need that approach that was tailored to another set of conditions when one didn't really understand why there was an appeal for this new this supply, this enormous popularity of first the cinema, then radio, then television. People couldn't understand why people would now suddenly devote 20, 30 hours of their week to this medium and forget about all the games and jolly evenings they used to have together and talking in the family and all kinds of social events were all being subordinated to one rather continuous, empty pastime. Now that was the kind of problem that use and gratifications research was meant to deal with in various ways, both as methodologically, conceptually, also as kind of normatively, because the normative basis of use and gratification research is not to make judgments. It is to cultural judgments or moral judgments about what people do, but to try to identify motives and purposes and understand them. Just as an example of how I came to, in a way, realize this, when I chose to do I was an assistant in the research, television research student, working on a very standard type of panel study of an election campaign based on an American, a famous American model for the 1959 election. And then I chose to do a PhD following my own interests, and I chose to take the question of drama plays, that is, on television. And a feature of television at the time at that period was there was a great deal of what one would be regarded as quality drama, so from the repertoire, classical repertoire of the theatre of all types, you had a great many plays were being performed and shown, often live and in the studio, and then just broadcast. There was very little attempt to tailor the content to mass taste. So you had, for a short time, a kind of experimental situation of an undifferentiated mass public finding themselves watching Chekhov or Ibsen or, well, Shakespeare, all kinds of things that you wouldn't expect. And I hoped by investigating this to discover something about the possibilities for more cultural equality and the breaking down of barriers between the classes in cultural terms. Well, somehow or other, I ended up with very little to show for where I was going until I started to look at some of the available literature on television use and television effects, and it occurred to me that a so-called functional approach, that is, not looking at the quality of content, but what it did for people, what satisfaction it might provide a better way into the problem and a better way out at the other end. And in fact, I would say it did, because there was no real explanation that helped much in terms of cultural background or aesthetic criteria. People don't have those things. They like things or they don't like things in an evening's television viewing. But the lines of liking and disliking did follow patterns of expectation of being excited or being entertained or being amused. So familiar theatre, drama satisfactions from the time of Aristotle, I suppose, were at work, and this is almost part of the basis of the uses and gratifications study. So gratification is a pleasure or satisfaction that is obtained from art, literature, entertainment, whatever, and that is, in a way, a much better way in than trying to think of it in terms of cultural criteria or aesthetic criteria. Not that one isn't able to do that, and since then something in the way of more refinement has been done for aesthetic criteria, but it's never worked very well empirically. Anyway, the point is that the approach seemed to offer something, and applied to the case of the television and election campaign, because that our first study was followed by the one with Jay, which was a much more developed one, which incorporated the ideas of uses and gratifications. Because the big problem with the first study was one had, in the end, say, vast amount of political stuff consumed. There wasn't anything else to do. There were only two channels, or even one, maybe that time. No, there were perhaps two TV channels. So if you turned on the television, you were watching a party election broadcast. And if you tried to turn to the other channel, the same party election broadcast was on it. So you had very high ratings for a brief moment in history. Television was politics was one of those popular subjects, because there was anything else to do in Leeds on a wet night. Anyway, that led to large audiences, however, not necessarily enthusiastic audiences. And the way to understand why weren't they all converted one way or the other? Well, apart from the fact that one lot cancelled out the other, they were getting quite different things out of it. Some people were being entertained. Since then, we've come to think about the excitement of the horse race, and politics has become covered, as in the recent election, every election in the United States, as a race between two candidates. What they have to say doesn't matter. It's whether they're winning or losing, and so on. That's what matters. It's tactics and the game. Well, that's of course, it's not really what matters, but that's what matters to draw in audiences. So one was dealing with the things that create audiences. Well, I'm sort of confirming that there were certainly positive and well, important contributions, and at the time very very interesting lines of research which have not been lost. They've been incorporated in other types of research design, but as a separate enterprise, uses and gratifications did tend to reach a certain point and then be left somewhat stagnant, although there has been a revival since in more recent times. And Jay mentioned a couple of the reasons why it was neglected, became somewhat neglected, or became an object of critique. Well, I'll leave aside the fact that it was criticized from cultural theory, critical theory point of view. It was regarded as a kind of part of information collecting, but for the machine, for management to manipulate people all the better if you could only get to their hidden desires. So it was suspect a little bit politically by in those days, times of more ideologically motivated research and theory. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I suspect that's true. But moreover, it was seen to be, and this is less of not so much a political point, but a real point, that it was very much followed a behavioristic, statistical turn, and well, positivistic, psychologistic, and lost, and it gave way in the end to alternative approaches to the audience based on reception, understanding, and depth. So the method of variable analysis was, although it had been highly developed in the approach, became an object of suspicion, and well, not just suspicion. It just didn't actually work very well. Another, and the only other I mention, weakness, and perhaps it's the biggest weakness, I don't know, is that the weakness of the theory. There is no one, I'm not sure anyone really claimed there was a theory of uses and gratifications, but the fact is there's a couple of weaknesses. One, maybe more, two big ones that I became aware of thinking about it. One is how circular it is, that you have tautological, you have a looked for gratification, like surveillance, finding out what's going on in the world, keeping up with your friends or something. You have some content that seems to do that sort of describes a certain content, like watching the news. You have watching the news, and then you have learning something from the news. And these things do tend to go together in a logical way, but that's part of the normal pattern of events that you'd expect. Secondly, the underlying concept of gratification could be exchanged for motive, purpose, need. All these words tended to be interposed in the language used to describe what's going on. And what the differences is between these different terms is rarely made very clear, and it's not easy to make them clear. In fact, I don't think it's possible to give clear definitions of these things, although, well, you might be able, I'm not saying it isn't possible. At that point it wasn't. At that point in the 80s or so, it wasn't possible. Maybe there has been some movement since then. Well, there are other things. For instance, the fact that the so-called gratification or satisfaction provided by a particular kind of content on television, like what we use, is part of its definition. It's built in. We have an image of content. We know its comedies are funny, and we know that the news is informative about the world and good for citizens to watch. And these things are very hard to separate out from a personal assessment. What really honestly people feel about the news. And then, of course, there is much evidence that people don't feel that way about the news at all. The news is something that signals the fact that it's time for a cup of cocoa or something to go to bed with, or it's just something that helps you to, when you're washing the dishes, to keep your mind occupied. It has no substantive great meaning. Okay. Enough of critique, because although it's not the end of the story, because I just want to take a few minutes to say, looking now at what is currently, when I think about it, what are relevant things for this approach to turn to. Well, before I leave that, just one thing, when I was thinking about this seminar, one thing I sort of relearned or realized was that in the phrase uses and gratifications, uses doesn't really mean uses in the sense of media use, this is a type of audience research that has always been current in terms of a kind of bookkeeping of which medium people watch for what and how long and which they prefer. That is media use and how much time is spent. But in the phrase uses and gratifications, uses means rather something different. And the key to that is, as I saw and came across in a quotation from Katz's famous manifesto in 1959, and more or less his words are, even the most potent media content cannot influence an individual, so there's effect is a notion there, who has no use for it in the social or psychological context in which he lives. The uses approach assumes that people's values, interests, associations, social roles are prepotent, and people, something, what they see and hear, fashion in quotes, what they see and hear to these interests. So uses is that, it's kind of giving a significance or attaching a certain personal meaning to some experience, some message received, some communication. So not the physical act of, not the behaviour of choice. As I say, I'd forgotten that, and I kind of was in my mind. Gratifications are those things, satisfactions. Uses are what you do with the media, and it's not really the case quite. Now the going to the end point. Well, what's it all? What does it do for us? Now I kind of the initial use of gratification approach was a kind of challenge, in a sense, to the mass paradigm, and it was sort of in defence of the people, if you like, saying that really it's not like that. People are still human beings, and they still make choices, and they're still individuals, and so on. Well, now that doesn't seem we don't need that, because there is no challenge. There is no such enemy to be challenged, because there is no mass media of that nature. However, there is still the possibility that the internet isn't all it seems. That it could be like there are a number of people who make their living out of writing books, saying what a terrible thing it is and how dangerous it is and how you must watch out for it. And from some points of view, it's not all that innocent, and it's not really dedicated to individual autonomy. It's being agglomerated and conglomerated and brought together, and it's being used to get attention for advertising, commercial purposes, and it could be for other purposes, of course, eventually. So the famed autonomy of the internet user is not guaranteed by the image of the internet as it was founded, and as some have still tried to maintain it. It's still relatively free from control and regulation, but not from commercial concentration. So the defeat of the old paradigm is not certain. That dragon is still somewhere there in its cage, I think. But leaving that aside, not important. Why would I see relevance for use in gratification? Well, a number of things, and some just small ones I just mentioned, a kind of catalogue, not just very short list. One is social media. I have never really understood the appeal of social media. Well, probably because I'm such an unsocial person, but nevertheless, I have this open mind that goes at being a use of gratification research, and I'm willing to believe it has some of the things that Zuckerberg or whatever it is says it has and does for people, but I'm not really convinced. However, that's not important. I still don't really understand it, and I think it deserves a good dose of understanding. And I'm sure there are people doing that. It's not that I don't even know, because I haven't really kept up with what vast amount of research that has been done, and certainly not what you might be doing. Another object of potential inquiry that is really also of great interest is the motives and satisfactions of participating, of being the producer, the so-called prosumer, the person who contributes whatever in whatever form. That is a whole new area of communication. The bloggers and the people who write in comments and reviews and contribute articles to Wikipedia. There's a whole new world of communication activity that is not, I don't think, has been charted. At least it may have been. I don't know. It's certainly still ongoing and growing and developing. Another type of problem for which the ideas of using gratifications are relevant, so-called affinity of internet. Now, one of the things that in early days of research was of concern was so-called affinity with different media, so attachments to the main alternative media. Well, that problematic is still with us because of competition between media, and the decline of some and rise of others, and the potential interchangeability of media and so on. There are a whole lot of issues around there, including that of the digital divide, because if there are clearly large minorities who have no affinity with the internet, and I'm sure will never have. And what do we do about it? And is it possible to do anything? And how do we understand it? How do we make sense of it? The question of addiction I mentioned briefly in passing. Well, it's pretty well clear enough, but we're not talking about just addiction, as in the case of watching too much television. We are talking of particular addictions. We are, I think, generally impact on daily life. Yes, how is patterns of daily living? Well, that's too is not only, it's partly a matter of behavior and time use and other things, but perceptions and valuations and norms is also built into that, because there are norms for in families and societies for internet use. One just last point that occurred to me rather late in the day was in the early days of so-called new media research, and these were really before anything like a developed internet existed. You did have computer-based CMC type media, perhaps, but there were attempts to characterize CMC and that sort of that kind of contact as having more or less features such as social presence or personal warmth. There were a set of characteristics associated either with old media or new media, and it seemed to be a promising way into explaining preferences and valuations of these different media. Well, I can't see that we need that is something just to forget. The question of interactivity, it's of course connected also with the social media problematic. How far does that seem like a real form of social contact? And my main source of information is my grandchildren, I have to say. They've stopped using the Facebook rather, because it took up too much time, and they thought it was sad that school friends were spending all their time trying to catch up with all the contacts they had. Anyway, that is whether what they're doing, what they think they're doing, but I think it's quite interesting to know that. Well, I've sort of tried to go through quite a lot of different things superficially, but adding to rather than glossing on or taking away for anything Jay has said, which pretty well I agree with. One thing I don't disagree with that. I just add a point. Jay mentioned the typology that emerged in the 1960s, actually, from some of these studies, and in fact it was a fourfold typology, I think, not a threefold one, because personal identity was separate from social contact. So the social interaction one was centered on having topics of conversation and things like that. So that was separate, but anyway, it was the personal identity was more personal identity. Anyway, it was by the person with the machine, if you like. Vast number of internet events do belong in that category, which are purely defined by an instrumental a purpose, a practical purpose. But the other headings seem to cover pretty well all that might be wanted in the way of well, by a bit of imagination. Well, they are very compressed, covering a large ground anyway. But they, if one's thinking of general categories, I don't know that I could extend that, which in a way speaks a little for some bit of the theory which is still valid and above suspicion. Okay, well, that's all. Thanks.